Maya Chen had been fighting for 3 years when she made the decision that would change everything. The 17-year-old girl stood in the ruins of what used to be downtown Portland, her military-issued rifle heavy in her small hands. Smoke drifted through the broken windows of abandoned buildings, carrying the metallic smell of gunpowder and something worse that she tried not to think about. The war had started when she was 14, just a freshman in high school worried about algebra tests and whether Jake Morrison would ask her to the spring dance. Now she couldn't remember the last time she'd slept in a real bed or eaten a meal that didn't come from a can. The coalition forces had been pushing deeper into American territory for months, and Maya's unit was one of the last holdouts in the Pacific Northwest. She touched the scar that ran from her left temple to her jaw, a reminder of the ambush 6 months ago that had killed half her squad. The explosion had left her deaf in one ear and given her nightmares that made sleep almost impossible. But it had also taught her something important about survival and about the weight of the choices she carried. Maya's commanding officer, Lieutenant Rodriguez, had been like a father to her since her real parents died in the bombing of Seattle. He was the one who taught her how to strip and clean a rifle in under 2 minutes, how to read enemy movement patterns, and how to push down the fear that tried to crawl up her throat during firefights. But Rodriguez was gone now, killed 3 days ago when their safe house was discovered. The remaining members of her unit looked to her for leadership, though she had never asked for it. There was Tommy, barely 16, who still cried quietly when he thought no one was listening. Sarah, 19, who had been a pre-med student before the war, and now served as their medic with hands that never stopped shaking. And Marcus, 22, a former high school football star who had lost his right leg below the knee but refused to slow down the group. They had been moving through the city for days, trying to reach the evacuation point at the harbor. Intelligence suggested that civilian transports were still running supplies to the safe zones in Alaska, and their orders were to get as many survivors out as possible. But the coalition had been systematically cutting off escape routes, turning what should have been a simple extraction into a deadly game of cat and mouse. Maya crouched behind an overturned car, watching enemy soldiers move through the street 2 blocks ahead. She counted at least 15 of them, all armed with the latest coalition weaponry. Her own rifle felt ancient in comparison, a standard-issue weapon that jammed more often than it should, and had been repaired with duct tape and hope more times than she could count. The girl studied the enemy patrol patterns, noting how they moved in groups of 3, how they communicated with hand signals, and how they always left one person watching their backs. She had learned to read these details the way other teenagers read social media posts, and right now those details were telling her that a direct confrontation would be suicide. But there was another way. Maya's grandfather had been a traditional archer before the war, competing in tournaments across the country and teaching traditional hunting methods to anyone who would listen. When Maya was young, she had spent summers at his cabin in the mountains, learning to make her own arrows and to hit targets from distances that seemed impossible. Her grandfather always said that a bow was silent, reliable, and deadly in the right hands. More importantly, her grandfather had been an engineer before he became an archer. In his workshop, he had shown Maya how to modify arrows for different purposes. Some were designed for piercing armor. Others were built for maximum damage to soft targets. And a few, the ones he called his special projects, were designed for situations where traditional warfare wasn't enough. Those special arrows were still hidden in Maya's pack, carefully wrapped and protected through 3 years of running and fighting. She had never used them, partly because she had never needed to, and partly because she wasn't sure she was ready for what they could do. But as she watched the enemy patrol moving closer to where Tommy and Sarah were hidden, she realized that ready or not, the time had come. Maya pulled the disassembled bow from her pack, her fingers moving automatically through the familiar process of putting it together. The weapon had been her grandfather's prized possession, made from laminated bamboo and carbon fiber that he had crafted himself. It was shorter than a traditional longbow but more powerful than most modern compound bows, and it was completely silent. She strung the bow with practiced efficiency, testing the tension and adjusting the sight pins that her grandfather had installed. The weapon felt different from her rifle, more personal somehow, like an extension of her own body rather than a tool she was carrying. When she nocked her first arrow, a traditional broadhead designed for hunting, she felt a calmness that she hadn't experienced in months. The first enemy soldier died without knowing what hit him. Maya's arrow took him in the neck from 70 yards away, dropping him silently to the pavement. His partners didn't notice for almost a full minute, and by then Maya had already repositioned herself and was drawing back for her second shot. The second arrow punched through the soldier's body armor like it was paper. Maya's grandfather had designed these arrows specifically for modern military equipment, using tungsten tips and carbon fiber shafts that could penetrate almost anything. The soldier stumbled backward, clutching his chest, and his scream echoed through the empty streets. Now the enemy knew they were under attack, but they couldn't figure out where the shots were coming from. Maya watched them scramble for cover, shouting orders and spinning in circles as they tried to identify the threat. They were trained for gunfights, not for an invisible archer who could strike from any direction. Maya moved again, using the shadows and debris to stay hidden while she lined up her third shot. This arrow was different from the first two. This one had a small cylindrical attachment just behind the broadhead, and when she released it, she started counting seconds in her head. The arrow struck the ground in the middle of the enemy formation. For a moment, nothing happened, and Maya could see confusion on the soldiers' faces as they stared at what looked like a simple hunting arrow. Then the attachment detonated, and the street erupted in fire and smoke. Maya's grandfather had called them surprise packages, and she was beginning to understand why. The explosion wasn't large enough to bring down buildings, but it was more than sufficient to scatter a group of soldiers and leave them vulnerable to follow-up attacks. Through the smoke and chaos, Maya could hear screaming and the sound of equipment being thrown around. When the smoke cleared, half the patrol was down, and the survivors were retreating in different directions. Maya had successfully broken up a coordinated enemy unit using nothing but a bow and 3 arrows, and she had done it without making a sound until the final explosion. But the victory felt hollow as Maya realized what she had just done. She had killed people with a weapon that felt more personal than any rifle. When she pulled a trigger, there was distance between her and the target, layers of technology and training that made it easier to think of enemies as objects rather than human beings. With the bow, every shot required her full attention and intention. She had to feel the draw weight, judge the wind, and release at exactly the right moment. Maya packed up her bow and moved toward where her squad was waiting. She could see Tommy's wide eyes staring at her from behind a pile of rubble, and she wondered what he was thinking. Sarah and Marcus emerged from their hiding spots, both looking at Maya with expressions that mixed relief with something that might have been fear. Nobody spoke as they continued through the city, but Maya could feel their eyes on her as she walked. She had always been a good soldier, reliable and steady under pressure. But what she had just done was something different, something that set her apart from the others in ways that made her uncomfortable. As they reached the next checkpoint, Maya made a decision that surprised even herself. She stopped walking, unslung her rifle, and let it fall to the ground with a metallic clatter that echoed off the broken buildings around them. Tommy jumped at the sound, and Sarah actually gasped. Maya looked at each of them, seeing their confusion and concern. And she realized that she couldn't explain what was happening inside her head. The rifle represented 3 years of a war that had taken everything from her. It represented following orders and fighting other people's battles and becoming something that she had never wanted to be. The bow represented something else entirely. It represented her grandfather's wisdom and her own choice to fight on her own terms. It represented precision instead of spray and pray tactics, silence instead of noise, and a connection to something deeper than military training. Maya picked up her rifle one last time, checked to make sure it was unloaded, and handed it to Marcus. He took it automatically, still staring at her in confusion, and Maya could see questions forming in his eyes that she wasn't ready to answer. Instead, she adjusted the bow on her shoulder and started walking again, leaving her old weapon behind in the ruins of a city that had already seen too much violence. Behind her, she could hear her squad members whispering to each other, trying to understand what had just happened and what it meant for their mission. Maya didn't look back. She was focused on the road ahead and on the weight of the special arrows still hidden in her pack. She had a feeling that before this war was over, she was going to need every single one of them. The girl who had dropped her rifle and picked up a bow was about to discover that sometimes the most important battles are fought not just against external enemies, but against the expectations and limitations that others place on us. And sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the one that makes the most noise, but the one that strikes with precision and purpose from the shadows. Word spread quickly through the resistance network about the girl with the bow. Within a week of Maya's first engagement, radio chatter was buzzing with reports of impossible shots, enemy patrols disappearing without a trace, and a ghost archer who could strike from anywhere and vanish before reinforcements arrived. Maya's squad had reached the harbor evacuation point, but instead of boarding one of the transport ships to Alaska, Maya made another choice that surprised everyone. She told Tommy, Sarah, and Marcus to go ahead without her. She had work to finish in the city, and she couldn't do it while worrying about keeping other people safe. Sarah had argued with her for 3 hours, insisting that Maya was suffering from combat stress and making decisions that would get her killed. Marcus had offered to stay behind and fight with her, saying that his missing leg wouldn't slow her down if she was using a bow instead of running assault missions. Even Tommy, quiet Tommy, who rarely spoke above a whisper anymore, had begged Maya to come with them. But Maya's mind was made up. She had found something in herself during that first engagement, something that felt more real and more important than following evacuation orders. She was good with the bow, better than good, and there were still people trapped in the city who needed help getting out. So she watched her friends board the transport ship, and she waved goodbye as it disappeared into the gray morning fog. Then she turned around and walked back into the ruins of Portland, carrying nothing but her bow, her special arrows, and a determination that felt like fire in her chest. Maya spent the next month learning to be a different kind of soldier. Instead of moving with a squad, she moved alone, using abandoned buildings and sewer tunnels to travel unseen through enemy territory. Instead of following orders from commanding officers, she made her own decisions about when to fight and when to hide. She established a base of operations in an old library that had been gutted by fire, but still had enough structure to provide shelter. The upper floors were too damaged to support much weight, but the basement was intact, and Maya found that she could access it through a storm drain that opened 3 blocks away. It was the perfect hideout for someone who needed to disappear quickly after making trouble for enemy patrols. Maya's new style of warfare was unlike anything the coalition forces had encountered before. She would study their patrol routes for days, learning their habits and identifying their weaknesses. Then she would strike at the moment when they were most vulnerable, using arrows that seemed to come from nowhere and hit with devastating precision. Her arrows weren't just weapons anymore. They were messages. Every shot told the enemy that they weren't safe, that someone was watching them, and that their technological advantages meant nothing against an opponent who could strike from the shadows and disappear without a trace. Maya's grandfather had left her more than just traditional arrows. Hidden in a secret compartment in his workshop, she had found designs for arrows that he had never shown her before. Some were equipped with small cameras that could transmit real-time intelligence about enemy positions. Others carried tiny explosive charges that could disable vehicles or communication equipment. And a few carried something even more dangerous: The incendiary arrows were Maya's grandfather's masterpiece. Each one contained a chemical mixture that would ignite on impact and burn at temperatures hot enough to melt through steel. Her grandfather had designed them for destroying equipment, but Maya quickly realized that they were also perfect for creating distractions and spreading fear among enemy ranks. Maya's first use of an incendiary arrow came when she discovered a coalition supply depot that was being used to store ammunition for the entire district. The facility was too heavily guarded for a traditional assault, but Maya didn't need to get inside to destroy it. She just needed to get close enough for one perfect shot. She spent 3 days studying the depot, learning the guard rotations, and identifying the best approach routes. The facility was surrounded by a 12-foot fence topped with razor wire, and there were always at least 6 guards on duty. But Maya noticed that the fuel storage tanks were visible from a building about 200 yards away, and that there was a brief window each evening when the guards changed shifts. On the 3rd night, Maya positioned herself on the roof of an abandoned office building and waited for her moment. When the evening shift change began and the guards were distracted, she drew back her bow and aimed at the largest fuel tank. The incendiary arrow flew straight and true, striking the tank just below the valve assembly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the entire depot erupted in a fireball that could be seen for miles. Secondary explosions continued for almost an hour as ammunition stores detonated and fuel fires spread to other buildings. By the time firefighting crews arrived, the entire facility had been reduced to twisted metal and smoking craters. Maya watched the destruction from her rooftop position, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and horror. She had just destroyed millions of dollars worth of enemy supplies and probably saved dozens of American lives by disrupting coalition operations in the district. But she had also killed an unknown number of enemy soldiers, and the weight of that responsibility was getting harder to carry. The next morning, Maya discovered that her attack on the depot had consequences she hadn't expected. Radio intercepts revealed that the coalition command was convinced that they were dealing with a large-scale resistance cell equipped with advanced weapons and explosives. They began deploying additional troops to the area and implementing new security measures that made it harder for civilian evacuation efforts to continue. Maya realized that her solo war against the coalition was having effects that reached far beyond her immediate targets. Every successful attack prompted increased retaliation against civilian populations. Every destroyed patrol led to tighter security measures that made life harder for the people she was trying to protect. But she also learned that her attacks were inspiring other resistance fighters to be bolder in their own operations. Reports came in from across the region of sabotage missions that had been planned and executed using tactics similar to Maya's. Small groups of fighters were abandoning conventional weapons and learning to build improvised explosive devices that could be delivered by bow and arrow. The coalition began offering rewards for information about the Ghost Archer, and Maya saw her own face on wanted posters that appeared throughout the occupied territories. The drawing wasn't very accurate. It made her look older and more threatening than she really was. But it was still strange to see herself portrayed as a major enemy threat. Maya's reputation eventually reached the ears of other organized resistance groups, and she began receiving visitors at her library hideout. They came at night, using coded radio signals and elaborate security protocols, and they all had the same message. They wanted to learn from her. The first group consisted of 3 teenagers from a suburb north of the city. They had been fighting the coalition for months, using hunting rifles and homemade bombs, but they had lost half their original members to enemy retaliation. They wanted to know how Maya managed to attack enemy positions without suffering casualties herself. Maya taught them about patience and observation, about studying enemy patterns and choosing targets that would have maximum impact with minimum risk. She showed them how to modify arrows for different purposes and how to use the bow's silence to their advantage. Most importantly, she taught them that the goal wasn't to win dramatic victories, but to make the enemy's occupation as difficult and expensive as possible. The second group was older, former military personnel who had been cut off from their units during the initial coalition advance. They were skilled fighters, but they had been trained for conventional warfare and were struggling to adapt to guerrilla tactics. Maya worked with them on stealth techniques and unconventional weapons, helping them understand that sometimes the most effective weapon was the one the enemy least expected. Word of Maya's training sessions spread through the underground network, and soon she was receiving requests for help from resistance cells across the entire Pacific Northwest. Some wanted tactical advice, others wanted to learn how to build specialized arrows. A few wanted her to join their operations as a sniper or special weapons expert. Maya turned down most of these requests, but she continued teaching small groups who made the dangerous journey to her library hideout. She developed a training program that covered everything from basic archery techniques to advanced tactics for urban warfare. Her students learned how to make their own bows from scavenged materials, how to craft arrows using improvised components, and how to plan attacks that would minimize civilian casualties. But Maya's greatest contribution to the resistance wasn't her fighting skills or her specialized weapons. It was her example of what one person could accomplish by refusing to accept conventional limitations. Her students went back to their own groups with a new understanding of what was possible, and that understanding began to change the nature of the resistance movement itself. The coalition forces found themselves dealing with an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Traditional military tactics were useless against fighters who could strike from unexpected directions using weapons that didn't show up on electronic detection systems. The psychological impact of facing an invisible, unpredictable enemy was taking a toll on coalition morale and effectiveness. Maya could see the changes happening around her, and she began to realize that she had become something more than just another resistance fighter. She had become a symbol of hope for people who had thought the war was already lost. Her story was being passed from group to group, inspiring others to believe that they could make a difference even when they felt powerless against overwhelming odds. But symbols carry responsibilities that Maya hadn't anticipated. As her reputation grew, so did the expectations placed on her. People began looking to her not just for tactical advice, but for leadership in a larger sense. They wanted her to coordinate resistance activities across multiple regions, to serve as a spokesperson for the movement, and to represent their hopes for victory against the coalition. Maya found herself at a crossroads. She could continue operating as a lone wolf, using her skills to fight small battles and teach others to do the same. Or she could step into a larger role, accepting the responsibilities that came with being a symbol and trying to help organize a more effective resistance movement. The choice became urgent when Maya intercepted coalition communications indicating that they were planning a major offensive designed to crush all resistance activity in the region. The attack would target known resistance hideouts, suspected civilian supporters, and infrastructure that could be used by guerrilla fighters. It was scheduled to begin in less than 2 weeks. Maya realized that her individual actions, no matter how skillful or dramatic, wouldn't be enough to stop an operation of this magnitude. But if she could bring together the various resistance groups she had been training and coordinate their efforts, they might be able to disrupt the coalition's plans and save countless lives. The girl who had dropped her rifle and picked up a bow was about to face her greatest challenge yet. Not just as a fighter, but as a leader who would have to convince others to follow her into a battle that would determine the fate of everyone they were fighting to protect. The meeting took place in an abandoned subway tunnel 30 feet below the city streets. Maya had chosen the location carefully, using maps from the library to find a section of the old transit system that had been sealed off since before the war. The tunnel was dry, defensible, and had multiple exit routes in case the gathering was discovered. Representatives from 12 different resistance groups made the dangerous journey to attend Maya's emergency council. They came from as far north as Seattle and as far south as Eugene, each risking capture or death to hear what the ghost archer had to say. Maya looked at their faces in the dim light of battery-powered lanterns and saw exhaustion, desperation, and a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they could still win this war. Maya spread the intercepted coalition communications across a makeshift table made from a sheet of plywood, balanced on concrete blocks. The documents detailed Operation Clean Sweep, a coordinated assault designed to eliminate all resistance activity in the Pacific Northwest within 72 hours. The coalition was planning to deploy 3 full divisions, supported by airstrikes and electronic warfare units that could jam all civilian communications. The attack would begin simultaneously in 6 major population centers with the goal of destroying resistance infrastructure and capturing or killing key leaders. Maya's own face appeared on a target list that included detailed intelligence about her library hideout, her training activities, and her estimated capabilities. Someone had been watching her very carefully, but the coalition had made a critical error in their intelligence gathering. They were still thinking of the resistance as a conventional military force that could be defeated through superior firepower and coordinated tactics. They didn't understand that Maya had been teaching groups throughout the region to operate as independent cells that could function without centralized command or communication. Maya explained her plan to the assembled resistance leaders, using hand-drawn maps to show how each group could contribute to a coordinated defense without compromising their individual security. Instead of trying to fight the coalition head-on, they would use the enemy's expectations against them, allowing the initial assault to proceed while launching surprise attacks against targets the coalition thought were secure. The key to Maya's strategy was timing and misdirection. While coalition forces were attacking known resistance positions, small teams of archers would be targeting their supply lines, communication centers, and staging areas. The goal wasn't to stop the assault, but to make it so chaotic and expensive that the coalition would be forced to withdraw before achieving their objectives. Maya had been saving her most advanced arrows for exactly this kind of situation. Her grandfather's final designs included arrows that could disable electronic equipment using electromagnetic pulse charges, arrows that could deliver smoke screens to cover troop movements, and arrows that could create sustained fires to block roads and landing zones. But Maya's most secret weapon wasn't technological. It was psychological. For months, coalition forces had been dealing with an enemy that seemed to possess supernatural abilities. Maya intended to use that fear to her advantage, creating the impression that the resistance had resources and capabilities far beyond what the coalition had anticipated. The first phase of Operation Clean Sweep began exactly as the intercepted communications had indicated. Coalition forces moved against 12 known resistance hideouts simultaneously, using overwhelming force to crush any opposition. But when the smoke cleared and the assault teams reported back to their commanders, they discovered that they had captured empty buildings and abandoned equipment. Maya's warning had given the resistance groups just enough time to evacuate their primary bases and relocate to secondary positions that the coalition didn't know about. Instead of destroying the resistance network, the coalition's first wave of attacks had revealed the full extent of their intelligence while accomplishing almost nothing. The second phase of Maya's plan began immediately after the coalition assault teams reported their initial results. While enemy commanders were trying to understand how their intelligence had been compromised, Maya and her trained archers were already moving against their real targets. Maya herself took responsibility for the most dangerous mission. The coalition's regional command center was located in a heavily fortified building downtown, protected by multiple layers of security and surrounded by troops. Traditional assault methods would have been impossible, but Maya wasn't planning a traditional assault. She approached the command center from an angle that the security planners had never considered. The building's roof was 30 stories above street level, too high for conventional sniper fire and too well protected for helicopter assault. But Maya had discovered that there was another building 4 blocks away, with an unobstructed line of sight to the command center's main communication array. Maya spent 6 hours climbing through the ruins of the neighboring building, using ropes and improvised climbing gear to reach a position where she could see her target. The shot would be the most difficult she had ever attempted, requiring her to account for wind conditions, building sway, and the angle of trajectory over such a long distance. Maya used one of her grandfather's electromagnetic pulse arrows for the shot, aiming not for personnel, but for the massive satellite dish that served as the command center's primary communication link. The arrow flew true, striking the dish's control housing and detonating its EMP charge exactly as designed. The effect was immediate and devastating. The command center lost all external communications, just as coalition forces throughout the region were calling for reinforcements and updated orders. What should have been a coordinated military operation suddenly became a collection of independent units operating without central guidance. While Maya was disrupting coalition communications, other Archer teams were implementing their own parts of the plan. A group of teenagers from the northern suburbs used incendiary arrows to block the main highway that coalition reinforcements were using to reach the city. Former soldiers in the eastern districts targeted fuel depots and ammunition storage areas, creating explosions that could be heard for miles. Most importantly, Maya's students were demonstrating the effectiveness of the tactics she had taught them. Small teams of archers were appearing throughout the region, striking targets that the coalition had never thought to defend and disappearing before enemy forces could respond. The coalition's response to these attacks revealed just how effectively Maya's psychological warfare was working. Radio intercepts showed that enemy commanders were convinced they were facing a much larger and better equipped force than actually existed. Reports from the field described impossible shots, ghost archers who could strike from any direction, and coordinated attacks that suggested a level of organization that the coalition hadn't anticipated. Within 12 hours, Operation Clean Sweep had devolved into chaos. Coalition units were calling for air support that couldn't be coordinated without working communications. Supply convoys were being attacked by enemies they couldn't see or locate, and enemy commanders were receiving contradictory reports that made it impossible to understand what was actually happening in the field. Maya monitored the situation from her library hideout, using a combination of radio intercepts and reports from resistance spotters to track the coalition's growing confusion. She could see that the momentum was shifting in favor of the resistance, but she also knew that the window of opportunity wouldn't last long. The coalition would eventually restore their communications and bring in additional resources to crush the resistance. Maya's tactics had bought time and created uncertainty, but they hadn't changed the fundamental balance of power. The resistance was still outnumbered and outgunned, and their success depended on maintaining the element of surprise. Maya made a decision that would define her legacy as a leader and a symbol of the resistance movement. Instead of trying to preserve her tactical advantage through continued secrecy, she decided to make herself visible to both her enemies and her allies. Maya positioned herself on the roof of the tallest building still standing in downtown Portland, in full view of coalition forces throughout the city. She carried her grandfather's bow and a quiver full of her most advanced arrows. And she wanted everyone to see exactly who she was and what she represented. The coalition spotted her within minutes, and Maya could see enemy snipers moving into position to take her out. But instead of hiding or retreating, Maya began methodically targeting coalition positions throughout the city, using her elevated position to reach targets that had previously been beyond her range. Each shot was carefully chosen for maximum psychological impact. Maya targeted enemy commanders, communication equipment, and key defensive positions, demonstrating that the coalition's advantages in technology and firepower meant nothing against an opponent who could strike with precision from an impossible position. But Maya's real message wasn't directed at the coalition forces. It was directed at every resistance fighter in the region who could see her silhouetted against the sky, standing alone against overwhelming odds and refusing to back down. Maya had become a symbol of defiance, and symbols have power that goes beyond their individual capabilities. Within hours, reports began coming in from across the region of resistance fighters abandoning their hiding places and engaging coalition forces directly. Maya's example had inspired others to take risks they had never considered before, and the psychological effect was spreading faster than the coalition could respond to it. Coalition commanders found themselves dealing with an enemy that was no longer trying to hide or avoid confrontation. Resistance fighters were appearing everywhere, using tactics that defied conventional military logic and displaying a level of confidence that suggested they believed they could actually win. Maya continued her rooftop demonstration for 3 hours until coalition forces finally managed to coordinate an artillery strike against her position. But by then, her message had been delivered and received. As Maya disappeared into the smoke and debris of the collapsing building, resistance fighters throughout the region were already implementing the tactics she had taught them. Maya survived the artillery strike by using the building's internal structure to reach a prepared escape route, but she emerged into a world that had changed fundamentally during her 3 hours on the rooftop. The resistance movement had transformed from a collection of desperate survivors into something approaching a real military force, and Maya found herself at the center of a revolution she had never intended to start. The girl who had dropped her rifle and picked up a bow had discovered that the most powerful weapon isn't always the one that causes the most destruction. Sometimes the most important victory is the one that convinces others that victory is possible. Maya's arrows had wounded the coalition, but her example had given the resistance something even more valuable than tactical success. It had given them hope. As Maya made her way through the ruins of the city, she could hear the sounds of fighting echoing from every direction. The war was far from over, but for the first time in years, the resistance had the initiative. Maya Chen, the 17-year-old girl who had learned to fight with a weapon her grandfather had crafted, had proven that sometimes the most ancient tools are exactly what's needed to solve the most modern problems. The coalition would eventually adapt to the new reality and develop countermeasures against archer-based tactics. But they would never again be able to dismiss the resistance as a minor nuisance that could be eliminated through conventional military operations. Maya had changed the rules of engagement, and neither side would ever be quite the same again.